Alright, welcome back everybody, and today we're going to be talking about GDP and going through a few calculations that are important for this course. So first off, we're always going to start with our definition of GDP. This is going to be our main motivator for understanding this concept, and it's a really key definition to keep in mind when we're working through these calculation problems. So GDP is the value of all goods and services that are produced or consumed in an economy in a given period. So anytime we're talking about value, we're always going to use currency. So for us, we're going to be using US dollars when we're talking about the US. And remember that production and consumption are kind of like two sides of the same coin. So we can calculate GDP by either adding up the total value of all goods that are produced in an economy in a given period, or by adding up the value of all goods and services that are consumed in an economy in a given period. So now let's talk about our formula. So we think of GDP, or we can call that total output, as being made up of these four components. So Y here represents GDP, our total output, and the first component that goes into GDP is C, or consumer spending. So consumer spending just includes all of the goods and services that are purchased by consumers. So if you go to the grocery store and buy some apples, if you buy a new laptop, if you go to get your clothes dry cleaned, these are all components of consumer spending. Next, we have I, or investment, and for economists, investment is the purchase of new capital. So this could be new equipment, new machines, investment in real estate, housing, factories, all of these types of things. Next, we have G, or government spending, and this includes government spending on things like infrastructure, so maybe new roads, new schools, things like that. And what's important to note is that government spending does not include transfer payments. So transfer payments might be Social Security benefits or Medicare payments. These things are not included in government spending because they're just considered a transfer of money, not necessarily a purchase of some good or service. And lastly, we have net exports. This is our last component of GDP. And so we calculate net exports by adding exports and subtracting imports. And the sort of intuition behind this from a production perspective is exports are things that we produce here in our economy and we send them to other countries, while imports are things that are produced in other countries that we purchase and consume here. So if we're adding up our GDP from a production standpoint, we can think, okay, we need to include all of the exports that were produced here, and then we need to subtract all of the imports that were produced somewhere else. Okay, before we move on to our first practice problem, we're going to talk about the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. This is another critical difference to be aware of whenever we're working through these problems. So nominal GDP is not adjusted for inflation. And what this means is that nominal GDP is calculated using prices from the current year. So when we add up the value of all the goods and services that are consumed in that economy, we're using prices from that current period. Whereas with real GDP is adjusted for inflation. So when we calculate real GDP, instead of using prices from that current year, we're going to use prices from a base year. And so that tells us that we're kind of calculating what GDP would be if there was no inflation, if prices had stayed the same as they were in that base year. All right, now we're going to move on to our practice problem, which is, we're starting up here in this table at the top. So kind of like when we worked on the PPF and we looked at a simplified economy that was only producing two goods, that's the same sort of model that we have here. So this is a table that is representing production or consumption in an economy. And what we see here is that this economy is only producing two goods. So we have QA, which is the quantity of apples, that's the first good. And then we have QB, which is the quantity of beef, that's the second good. And then to go along with that, we have PA, which is the price of apples, and PB, which is the price of beef. And as you see, each row in this table is giving us the price and quantities in that economy for each given year. So we're going to start out and we're going to calculate nominal GDP. So as we said, with nominal GDP, we're using the current year prices. So let's start and let's calculate nominal GDP for 2021. So for 2021. And our approach here is we're trying to find the value of all the goods and services that were produced in this economy. So we know that they produced in 2021 100 apples and 200 beef. So in order for us to find the total value of these 100 apples, we're going to multiply that by the price of apples. Because each apple is worth $2, and we have 100 apples. And then we're going to do a similar thing for beef. We know that each unit of beef is worth $10, and there was 200 units of beef produced. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add these together. And this is going to be the total value of all the goods and services that were produced in this economy in 2021. So our nominal GDP in 2021 is going to be $2,200. Now let's repeat these calculations for nominal GDP for 2022 and 2023. So I'm going to stop the recording here, and then you can check back in and confirm that we did the same calculations for nominal GDP for the next 2 years. All right, so I've completed my calculations of nominal GDP for 2022 and 2023. And so for 2022, our nominal GDP was 6,450. And for 2023, our nominal GDP was 15,800. And so just a reminder, whenever we're calculating nominal GDP, we want to be using prices for that current year. So for 2022, the price of apples was $3, and the price of beef was $15. So I took our quantity of apples in that year and multiplied it by the price to get the total value of all of the apples that were produced. And similarly for beef, added it up and then got our nominal GDP. And same sort of procedure for 2023. Okay, so now I've added the values that we calculated for nominal GDP to our table up here, and now we're going to calculate real GDP. And the trick that you can use to know whether you're supposed to be calculating nominal GDP or real GDP is that whenever you're being asked to calculate real GDP, you will be given the base year. So the base year needs to be specified. That way you know what your reference point is. Because remember, when we calculate real GDP, we're going to be using prices from the base year to adjust from inflation. So if we don't know the base year, we don't know what prices we're supposed to use. Okay, so let's start by calculating real GDP for 2021. And so this one is easy. We're just using prices for 2021 to calculate GDP. And we're going to follow the same sort of procedure. We know that in 2021, 100 apples were produced, and each apple is worth $2. So to get the total value of all the apples produced, we just multiply. And similarly for beef, we know that each unit of beef was worth $10, and 200 units of beef were produced. And so our real GDP in 2021 is $2,200. And you'll notice that this is actually the same as our nominal GDP, which confirms what was talked about in the lecture slides. In the base year, nominal GDP and real GDP should be equal. Okay, now let's calculate real GDP for 2022, again using the base year prices from 2021. So in 2022, 150 apples were produced, but remember that we're using that base year price of $2. So this is giving us the inflation adjusted value for that 150 apples. And then in 2022, 400 units of beef were produced, but we're still using that base year price. So our real GDP for 2022 should be $4,300. And lastly, for 2023, again, we're using those base year prices. We know that 200 units of apples were produced, and 500 units of beef were produced. And so our real GDP for 2023 should be $5,400. Okay, and so we see here that our inflation adjusted values for GDP, when we're not looking at the base year, are smaller than our nominal GDP values. So this sort of confirms the intuition that these have been adjusted for inflation, because with inflation, prices increase. So we expect nominal GDP to be higher than real GDP. Okay, our next step in this problem is to calculate the GDP deflator for each of our years. So the GDP deflator measures the current level of prices relative to the prices in the base year. And so what this is doing is it's giving us a measure of the overall level of prices. It's showing us what is really the difference in prices in the current year versus that base year. So here's our formula for the GDP deflator. We're gonna divide the nominal GDP in that year by the real GDP in that year, and then multiply by 100. So let's start by calculating the GDP deflator for 2021, and this one will be easy. So our nominal GDP in 2021 is $2,200, and our real GDP in this year is also $2,200, and so we know this is equal to 1. So basically we're just saying 1 times 100 is equal to 100. So our GDP deflator. Okay, so I went ahead and calculated our GDP deflator for 2022 and 2023, and the calculation is shown here so you can check your answer. Now our next step from here is we want to calculate the inflation rate. So we want to know how much have prices changed from 2021 to 2022, and how much have prices changed from 2022 to 2023. And we're going to do this by using our formula for the inflation rate. So our formula here So this is our formula for the inflation rate. So whenever we're calculating this sort of percent change problem, we are going to take the value from the second period minus the value from the first period, divide that by the value from the first period, and then multiply by 100. And what this is going to tell us is it's going to tell us the percent change in price from one year to the next. All right, so first let's calculate the percent change in prices or inflation from 2021 to 2022. And this is the whole tool, this is the whole purpose of the GDP deflator. So we're going to calculate this percent change using our GDP deflator. So our value 2, our value in the second period, is the GDP deflator from 2022, and our value 1 is the GDP deflator from 2021, our first period. So our formula will look like this. So we have our value from the second period minus our value from the first period divided by that value from the first period, all multiplied by 100. And this tells us that there was a 50% increase in prices from 2021 to 2022. Now, usually we only compare years that are directly adjacent, so we wouldn't be comparing 2021 to 2023. So now let's calculate the percent change in prices from 2022 to 2023. Okay, so to calculate the percent change in prices from 2022 to 2023, we use the same formula. So our GDP deflator in the second period is 293. Our GDP deflator in the first period is 150. We plug that into our formula, and we get an inflation rate of about 95.3%. So that completes all the steps that you would need for this type of problem. Next, we're going to really quickly go over another type of GDP calculation problem that you might see. Okay, so the second type of GDP calculation problem that you might encounter is essentially just testing your knowledge of our formula for GDP. So y equals c plus I plus g plus nx is something you should memorize. It'll just make it a lot easier when you're working through the homework, the quizzes, things like that. So let's look at this table. And this table is telling us all of these values in billions of dollars for the US economy, let's say. So in the US economy, government purchases were 50 billion. Okay, so the second type of GDP calculation problem that you might encounter is really just testing your knowledge of our formula for GDP. So y equals c plus I plus g plus nx is something you should memorize. It'll just make your work a lot quicker whenever you're going through the homework, quizzes, exams, things like that. So we're going to look at this table here, and this table is telling us the dollar values of all of these different spending categories for the United States in 2023. And what a problem like this would ask would be, from the data in this table, what would we calculate GDP to be in this year? So we're just going to go down this table and say, is this item a component of GDP? And if it is, we'll add it in our formula. If it's not, we'll just ignore it. So first, we're looking at government purchases. Is government purchases a component of GDP? And yes, we know that it is. So we'll start our formula like this. GDP, or Y, is equal to 50. And then now we have this exports and import situation. And we know from our formula what we need to do here is we need to calculate net exports, which is going to be exports minus imports. So we'll say exports is 10 and imports is 12. So we can include that in our formula like this. Our next item is depreciation. And what depreciation is just the value that capital equipment loses over time. So a kind of way to think about this is when you go to buy a new car, maybe that car is worth $10,000 right when you buy it, but as soon as you start driving it, it's losing value over time. And so that loss in value of that piece of machinery would be called depreciation. But we know depreciation is not a component of GDP, so we're just going to ignore this one. Next, we have investment, which we know is part of our GDP formula. So we'll add in this 30 for investment. Now we have domestic production abroad, and this is not included in our GDP formula. So because we're calculating GDP from a consumption perspective, we're just going to go ahead and ignore this production number, and the same thing will be true for this foreign production in the US. We don't need that. So the last thing we're left with is consumer spending, which of course is a component of our GDP. So we'll add that in to our formula and then total everything up to get our value for GDP in 2023. Okay, so we get 143 here, and so when we would express our answer, we would say that GDP is 143 billion, because remember, this table is reporting these values in billions of dollars, so we want to add the correct unit here. Okay, that's it for this video. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email. But it's really great to work through these practice problems. It'll help you on the worksheet and also for the quiz. Thanks.